Like the joiner video I recently posted, I bought the same Shelix cutter head for my 15-inch Grizzly Planer, more or less a cry once solution. It should last the life of the tool, and this video is about installing it. Hope you enjoy. The first step is to remove the dust shroud. There are 3 bolts at the top and 3 hex head bolts at the bottom. The hex head bolts at the bottom, or rather the top, will want to fall in and rumble around, so you really have to put your hand in there and get a hold of them before they get down into the workings of the planer. Remove the 4 hex head bolts that hold the top shroud on. It helps to have an expert dog to give supervision. Next, the belt guard comes off. It's just 2 thumb wheels or hand wheels. To take the belts off, you have to access the motor, so remove a side panel. I'm removing the wrong side here, but that's just my usual luck, so I removed the other one. The motor holds tension on the belts, so you simply release that tension with the bolts holding the motor down, and then you can fold down the tension arms. With a bar or wrench wedging the motor up, you can simply pull off the belts. With the belts pulled off and the planer definitely unplugged, you can remove the knives and also remove the knife carrier. If you changed your knives before or sharpened your knives, this is no different than that process up to this point. Loosen the belt pulley. And remove the pulley with a long reach puller. Say that 5 times fast. There are 2 lock Allen keys in this that I didn't see, so I'll show you how I dealt with that when I put it back on. There are 2 Sawdust Guards under the chain cover for the gearbox, and you have to remove them. You can try and get the cover off without removing them, but it will jam up and be challenging. Remove the height adjustment wheel. It's pretty straightforward. Once you get it off, you will have to put it back on temporarily to get the cutter head set up on some blocks. Remove the chain cover for the gearbox with the Allen head bolt. And of course, you should know at this point, if this is a recent Grizzly saw, all of these are metric fasteners. When you get the bolt out, it is wedged on with some rolled pins, so you have to sort of pry it off. Don't be afraid at this point. There's nothing else holding it on except those rolled pins. With the cover off, you have a drive gear and then 2 work gears that drive the in-feed and out-feed rollers, and you can remove the bolts that secure them in place. And remove the spring for the tensioner or the idler pulley that is up top that keeps the top chain from flopping. And I cut out the 22 times that I tried to grab it. After that, you can loosen the drive gear. With all of the bolts out, the 3 gears can come out simultaneously. It's a bit of a hold your mouth right maneuver. A little wedge with a screwdriver will get them moving, and there are keys for each of these gears, and you'll invariably lose one when they come out, so watch where it lands, pick them up, and make sure you have all 3 there at the end. Put the height adjustment wheel back on temporarily because we're going to want to put the cutter head on something to support it. Here I'm putting some blocks in so that the weight of the cutter head can be supported by the blocks. With the cutter head supported, the front bearing is actually in the gearbox, and the gearbox is held to the frame with the 4 hex head bolts up top. So as you remove them, you may have to wiggle the gearbox a little bit to get them to come completely free. Once they're all the way out, you ought to be able to slide the cutter head from the rear or the pulley bearing mount forward. If not, you can give a slight tap in the back. But you don't want to pull it out all the way yet. The next step is, while it's in a convenient position, go ahead and drain the gear oil out of it. And then we'll go ahead and remove the front cover, which has the speed selector gear locked into place. I believe there's 4 hex head bolts that hold the cover of the gearbox in place, and once you remove them, you ought to be able to separate the front cover from the base with either a putty knife or something else you can slide in. Be careful not to damage the gasket if you're going to reuse it. It will be messy. There's a lot of oil or gear oil that hasn't drained out, and be prepared to clean up a mess. So what I found worked is putting the gearbox in neutral, which puts the gearbox gear in the middle between the 2 drive gears, and then you can rotate the face out, or actually in 90 degrees from the gearbox, and that will give you room to get the fixed gear out at the lower end of the gearbox. So I rotated it and pulled it out, trying not to damage the gasket. With the cover removed and the oil drained and everything disconnected, you can slide the gearbox and cutter head assembly all the way out. The main drive gear is attached to the cutter head, and then that drives a secondary gear which will drive the feed rollers using the speed selector. So they both come out of their bearing mounts inside the gearbox. There's a grease seal on the back side of the gearbox, and it's held in by 3 small hex head bolts. This step isn't pretty, but the drive gear and the front or gearbox bearing for the cutter head has to be pressed out from the gearbox. The easiest way I found to do it was to use a workbench to hold the gearbox housing, and then a piece of good solid hardwood to slowly drive it out from the housing. If you're lucky, the drive gear will simply come off. There's a hex head bolt that holds it in. I wasn't, and I had to use a bearing puller. I also used the bearing puller for the pulley bearing and for the gearbox drive bearing. I had the bolt partially installed so that the bearing puller or gear puller would have something to press against, so I had to go ahead and remove it. And the same bearing puller is used for the rear bearing and the front gearbox bearing. I bought a new set of bearings, as the ones that were in the unit had a lot of wear on them, and the ones that come new are pretty cheap ones. So the ones they're selling now have a metal inner race, or not inner race, but a metal grease shield, and they're a lot tougher. But you can see here, I also wrapped the new cutter head in several layers of paper or newsprint, whatever you have on hand, because it will cut you up trying to handle it. I drove the pulley wheel side bearing, the larger one, in with a socket that was a good fit with the inner race, and it seated home without much issue. The gearbox side assembly is just the reverse of what it was coming apart. The grease shield goes on first, and because the Shelix cutter head has no slots that you can get down in, you're not going to be able to put the bolts back in. But I went ahead and included it, just thought it might do some good to keep the grease out. The bearing's a pretty good seal, so I don't think it'll be an issue. Same as before, get it started square, then drive it home with something that matches the inner race so you're not putting pressure on the bearing side. The drive gear actually fits into the inner race, so it's a pretty tight fit. Once you get it positioned, you do have to drive it in, but it doesn't put up a lot of resistance. It's a pretty good machine part. Once it's driven in, you can secure it with the hex head screw. Now, since the drive box housing is the outer race for the front bearing, this is pretty much an awkward process. You've got a really heavy cutter head, and you've got to reseat that bearing. Again, a good workbench helps. Get it lined up square so it's not binding, and use a wooden drive block and a mallet, and it goes in fairly well. One trick to pay attention to is that the drive gear set, they can't go in one at a time because they have to go in lined up with the gears, and there's not enough room in the bearing seats that they're going into. So you have to insert them already teeth engaged together, and then engage the top one with the drive gear that you installed on the cutter head. It sounds more complex than it is, but the short answer is they have to go in together. With the gears reseated in the empty drive box and the cutter head wrapped in paper, you can reinsert it. But you don't want to put it in all the way at this point. You want to slide it in far enough for the pulley or the belt side bearing to seat. And the reason you want to do that is you're going to need room to rotate the cover around the bearing shafts for the input and output feed rollers. So what I did there was the reverse of the way it came off. Go in at 90 degrees with the selector gear in neutral, stick it in between the two gear sets, then rotate it up, and then work to seat the bearings on the inner races of the gearbox. And once you get them seated, you can give it a tap, and you'll know for certain when they're driven home because the cover will seat square, and you can reinstall the bolts that hold the gearbox front cover in place. Once the gearbox is reassembled, you can drive it home to its final position. At this point, what you're doing is pushing the pulley wheel or the belt pulley wheel bearing into place. And here I am checking the hole alignment for the gearbox mount. And I went a little too far, so I'm just going to kind of tap it back. There's no there's no real play in it. It can only go in to the point where the mounting bolts for the gearbox will engage. The gear set goes on the reverse of how it came off. There's no real timing issue here, except that you've got to get it lined up that the chain hits them and they're both engaged with the little cutter or keyway pin. And as long as you didn't move them when you took them off, they should go back on fairly well. I've got the lower drive gear reversed here. It had come off. And I didn't catch that, and I figure it out pretty quick because it won't go back on that way. Now I've flipped it around, and it works just right. Reinstall the bolts that hold the drive gear as well as the drive wheel or input-output feed roller gears in place. Snug them down, and then you can move on to reattaching the tensioner pulley. And for the sake of everyone watching, I think I tried 8 times to get that spring back on there, and it finally got it on. Put the pulley on and secure it with a bolt, and then you can put the 3 belts on before attaching them to the motor end. Lift up on the motor and you should be able to put the 3 belts around the motor pulley. Reattach the tensioning arms to the motor mount and tighten them down. Here I've removed the mounting base for the belt guard and slid it out so I can tighten the 2 set screws on the pulley. Put the side panel back on. Refill the gearbox with 80 weight gear oil, and since you're doing general maintenance, changing bearings, etc., you might as well use brand new. I did apply oil to the chain and gears, and now I'm putting back on the gear guard. And holding it in place with a Allen head bolt. The top shroud goes back on and is held with the same 4 hex head bolts. The dust collection shroud goes back on with 3 Allen head bolts on the bottom and 3 hex head bolts on the top. I reattach the base to the fan guard where I had to remove it to tighten the set screws of the pulley, and then you can simply put the front part of the guard back on. So how does it work? It works amazing. It's a lot quieter, and it produces a shearing type cut that leaves an ultra smooth finish. A really great upgrade if you have a standard knife planer. The finish it makes is ready for glue up or can be ready for final finishing with just a few passes of a hand plane. All in all, it's a really fantastic investment. I wish you luck if you're taking on this project. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoy.